They called Precinct 18 untouchable, a fortress where a badge was a license for brutality, where evidence vanished on verbal command and even judges bowed to the demands of corrupted officers. For 20 years, they perfected their machinery. Every wrongful arrest had a purpose, every bribe was logged, and every witness was silenced. Until they arrested Eleanor Martens. They saw a retired teacher, 78 years old, an easy target, just another black woman to be disciplined for daring to walk through a wealthy, white neighborhood. They planned to keep her in holding for 24 hours, then quietly release her. Instead, they handed her a first-class ticket to the heart of their corrupt empire. She overheard conversations, witnessed tactics, violations. What they didn't know, Eleanor Martens had spent her life teaching generations to stand up against injustice. And now, as her son, the U.S. Attorney General, prepared to receive a very specific phone call, Eleanor was about to teach these officers a lesson they'd never forget. Because sometimes the most dangerous witness is the one no one noticed was watching. Late afternoon sunlight slanted across the polished aisles of Kruger's Select Market, a high-end grocery store nestled in Oak Heath, a quiet and affluent district. Eleanor Martens adjusted her white pearl necklace, a gift from a former student, as she examined fruit with the careful eye of someone who had cooked Sunday dinners for half a century. She paid no mind to the glances sliding past her, the other shoppers pretending not to be curious about her presence. She had lived in the city longer than many of them had even known Oak Heath existed. Near the entrance, two officers, Bruno Meinhardt, a large man with cropped blonde hair and eyes like cold steel, and his younger subordinate Leon Hartwig, eager to prove himself, watched intently. Bruno nodded toward Eleanor. "Look at her," he muttered, low but loaded. "Doesn't belong here. Want to check it out?" Leon asked, spine straight like a soldier awaiting orders. They approached Eleanor just as she was inspecting a bunch of organic bananas. Their footsteps deliberately heavy on the gleaming tile floor. "Ma'am," Bruno said in a falsely polite tone, the kind Eleanor had heard all her life and never failed to irritate her, "we've received reports of suspicious activity in the store." Eleanor calmly set the bananas down, her movements so composed they bordered on defiant. "I'm simply shopping, officer. I've lived in this city for over 50 years. Is that so?" Leon smirked, clearly skeptical. "And you frequent this store often?" "I go wherever I please, young man," Eleanor replied, her former teacher's cadence cutting through. "This store carries ingredients for my Sunday supper." Klaus Werner, the manager, a thin man in a crisply ironed shirt stiff with starch, approached, his eyes darting between Eleanor and the officers, his loyalty clearly decided. "She's been wandering around for nearly an hour," Klaus added, even though Eleanor had arrived less than 20 minutes ago. Some customers felt uncomfortable. Eleanor tightened her grip on her handbag. "That's absolutely false. I just got here, and I can show my parking receipt to prove it." Bruno stepped closer, violating her personal space. "Let's see some ID, ma'am." As Eleanor reached into her bag, Bruno suddenly grabbed her wrist, causing her to stagger. Before she could steady herself, he shoved her into the orange display, hundreds of fruit rolling and crashing to the floor. "Resisting, huh?" Bruno shouted, even though Eleanor had made no move to resist. "I didn't," she began, but Leon was already twisting her arms behind her back, cuffing her. Near the checkout lanes, Jonas Klein, a young black man, pulled out his phone and recorded the entire scene. His hands trembled with rage, but he kept the camera steady. Bruno noticed. He charged over. "Delete that video now." "I know my rights," Jonas snapped back, but Bruno snatched the phone, wrenching his wrist until Jonas cried out. "Delete it or you're going in with her," Bruno growled, then tossed the phone back once Jonas reluctantly complied. Eleanor saw everything. But her gaze held no fear. She had seen scenes like this far too many times, only this time she was the one in focus. As they dragged her past averted eyes of shoppers and employees, Eleanor spoke only once, clear and unwavering. "I want to speak with your commanding officer." Bruno sneered. "You should be grateful we're not adding obstruction of justice." They walked her out through the automatic doors into the golden light of sunset. On the sidewalk, no one was in sight, even though weather like this usually drew people to their porches. Eleanor noticed the body cams on their uniforms weren't lit. "Your cameras aren't recording," she remarked. "Technical issue," Leon muttered, glancing at Bruno with veiled meaning. The ride to the precinct took nearly an hour, though it should have been 15 minutes. They were trying to disorient her. But Eleanor memorized every turn, every street name. And inside her mind, a storm had begun to form. At Precinct 18, flickering fluorescent lights cast a dull glow over worn tiles. The air thick with the scent of stale coffee and a quiet, festering tension. Eleanor Martens was dragged into the intake area, the place where broken spirits often began their silent journey through a system with no room for truth. Officer Bruno Meinhardt filled out the report with a strange enthusiasm, each word delivered as if he were writing a stage play. Subject became aggressive during approach. He muttered loudly enough for Eleanor to hear. Attempted to assault officer. Resisted arrest. Eleanor sat upright in the rigid plastic chair, hands still cuffed behind her back, her gaze steady. All lies, she said, her voice calm, cold. A sergeant, coffee cup in hand, walked over, yawning. What VE we got here? Disturbing the peace, resisting arrest, assaulting an officer. Bruno recited each charge like a ridiculous refrain. With what exactly? The sergeant asked. Fruit display, Bruno smirked. The sergeant nodded, not bothering to look at Eleanor again. Book her. Chief Callahan wants this case nice and clean. At the mention of Callahan, Eleanor tilted her head slightly, committing the name to memory. The fingerprinting was unnecessarily rough. Each finger pressed down against the scanner like they meant to bruise her. During the mugshot, she held her head high, eyes locked forward. Even in cuffs, she radiated the poise of someone who once commanded a classroom of 40 students with a single look. I have the right to make a phone call, Eleanor stated as she was led to the holding cell. Bruno chuckled, his laugh echoing off the concrete halls. Maybe tomorrow, if we're not too busy. The cell door slammed shut with a metallic clang that rang down the corridor. The room was bare. A bolted metal bench and an exposed toilet. No privacy, no comfort. Eleanor sat, the cuffs still tight around her thin wrists. She listened. Every footstep in the hallway. Every voice drifting in from the control room. The laughter of officers joking about which bar they'd hit after their shift. And then Bruno's voice, speaking on the phone, probably to Chief Callahan, confirming that everything's been handled. She listened and remembered, all through the night, as the holding block fell into its usual quiet. Eleanor observed. She watched who brought files into the back archive room, who whispered in the dim corners, who patrolled without their body cams on. Every detail, names, behaviors, patterns, logged with precision into a mind sharpened by decades of teaching. At 3 a.m., when the night shift slipped into its lazy rhythm, 2 officers passed by her cell. Same as the old lady yesterday, one of them said. Cams off, clean report, judge signs done. Eleanor closed her eyes, not out of fatigue but to mentally arrange the timeline. Each cue, each overheard phrase was a puzzle piece falling into place. And she had begun to see the full picture. They didn't know who she was, didn't know who her son was, didn't realize the woman they dismissed was someone who had spent her life teaching young people how to resist injustice. As the first light of dawn filtered through the narrow window above her, Eleanor Martens was ready. They had given her more than just insult. They had handed her evidence, the right to observe, and the most righteous reason to bring their rotting system down. And she would not waste it. As the morning shift began at Precinct 18, Eleanor Martens remained seated in the cold, dim holding cell, her sharp eyes following every movement beyond the bars. She didn't need a notepad. The memory of a seasoned teacher was enough to store a vault of evidence. The sounds of a new shift echoed down the corridor, the clink of coffee mugs, lazy voices, footsteps pounding in rhythm on the floor. But no one noticed the elderly woman silently taking everything in. Keep the old lady in until the paperwork's complete, Officer Meinhardt's voice rang out down the row of cells. Don't want any loose ends. Eleanor tilted her head toward the door. A new opportunity to listen was approaching. By the coffee machine, Detective James Wilkes was chatting with 2 young officers. You boys wouldn't believe it, Wilkes said with a half-boast, half-mocking tone. Just plant a little bag in the trunk and boom, you've got a big bust. The department gets points, we get bonuses. Everyone's happy. One rookie hesitated. But what about body cams, sir? Wilkes chuckled, sipping his coffee. Malfunction. Battery died. Technical error. Ask Meinhardt about that old lady from last night. Eleanor observed each of them carefully, names, faces, habits, voices. Every detail a future piece of evidence. A little farther down, Sergeant Patrick Wald was combing through the overnight files. We need to clean up the Martens report. Smooth it out. Add a witness. What was that manager's name again? Thomas Parker, someone replied. Already got him to sign a statement. He had a theft issue in his store last year, doesn't want trouble. Eleanor nodded slightly. A veiled threat, a familiar tactic. From her cell, she had a clear view of the evidence room's partially open door. She watched as Detective Wilkes entered with a cardboard box labeled NRA 4789. Through the crack, she saw him pull out a few pieces of evidence, rearrange them, and close the lid. A female officer passed by, Detective Lisa Carter, according to her name tag. Her eyes swept over Eleanor, and unlike the others, they carried something else, confusion, maybe even conscience. She entered the evidence room where Wilkes was still handling the box. "You can't keep doing this, James," she said, voice low but firm. Wilkes shrugged. "Been doing it 15 years, Lisa. Nobody's noticed. Nobody wants to. Chief Callahan doesn't care as long as the stats look good." Before she could respond, Officer Harris burst in, face tense. "Orders from upstairs, wipe all body cam footage from last night. Direct from higher up." Lisa frowned. "Higher up? You mean the mayor?" "No. Judge Whitaker. Called personally. Another name." Eleanor didn't react, but her eyes sparked. This web was wider than she'd thought. A judge. A police chief. A mayor. A complete network. "We need everything scrubbed," Harris continued. "Even the kid who filmed in the store, Mitchell says they have a file. One misstep and he's done." All morning, Eleanor silently tracked the movement of officers and evidence. Cops came and went from the records room, deleting, replacing, editing, as if cleaning their desks instead of rewriting the law. Around noon, the atmosphere shifted. Chief Robert Callahan had arrived. He entered with a heavy stride, uniform crisp, gaze sharp as it scanned the hallway. Every officer straightened when he passed. At the front desk, he asked curtly, "What's the status on Martens?" "All set, sir," Sergeant Wald replied. "Clean report. Cams deleted. Witness verified." "Whitaker's expediting the process," Callahan nodded. "Let's wrap this up before anyone starts asking questions." As Callahan entered a meeting with his top staff, Eleanor closed her eyes. Not to rest, but to imprint every word, every face. Step by step, the web was revealing itself. And she was the one fly that had escaped, ready to expose the whole rotten cocoon. As the afternoon light stretched long through the narrow windows of Precinct 18, Eleanor Martens remained seated on the cold metal bench. She wasn't panicked. She didn't complain. With every passing minute, she gathered more evidence. A voice, a file, an irregular action. The cell door opened. Officer Lisa Carter stepped in, holding a paper cup of water and a neatly folded blanket. "Mrs. Martens," she said gently, passing the items through the slot. "I can't do much, but I thought you might need this." Eleanor took them, nodding in silent thanks. Their eyes met, witness and whistleblower. Not a trace of fear between them. Only the quiet understanding of two people awake in a world that prefers to sleep. "Lisa," Eleanor spoke, calm and measured. "If there's something you need to say, let me be the first to hear it." Lisa hesitated, then nodded. "I'll be back." Not 10 minutes after Lisa left, Officers Meinhardt and Harris appeared, their faces tight with unease. "Transfer order," Meinhardt said. "New directive from Chief Callahan. You're being moved to a high-security facility in the suburbs." Eleanor didn't flinch. She stood up and adjusted her collar. "No official notice. No lawyer. No court order. And you call this a legal transfer?" Harris looked unsure. "Just move first. Ask later." As they escorted her out of the cell, Eleanor scanned the room, committing every face, every detail to memory. Because she knew this was the moment to shift from observation to action. Meanwhile, in Brussels, her son, Julian Martens, the federal attorney general, was in a strategic meeting with his advisors. His private phone buzzed. The screen displayed an unknown number. He answered and heard only one sentence. "Your mother is being moved. No paperwork, no notice. Precinct 18. Julian shot to his feet. "Pause the meeting. Call the Rapid Response Unit. Alert the federal chief of security and lock down the entire northern transport corridor." "What's happening, sir?" one advisor asked. Julian's grip tightened around the phone. They just touched something they never should have. The vehicle transporting Eleanor had barely left the downtown area when it was intercepted by 3 unmarked black SUVs. Federal agents swarmed the scene. Harris reached for his weapon but was disarmed in a single move. Meinhardt was pulled from the driver's seat like a criminal. A clean-cut agent opened the back door. "Mrs. Martens, we're here to get you out safely." Eleanor looked at him, calm and resolute. "I trust you brought a search warrant, too?" The agent smiled. "We brought justice with us, ma'am." Back at Precinct 18, chaos erupted as the Federal Investigation Unit stormed the building. Every computer was sealed, every file bagged and tagged, every officer ordered to surrender badge and weapon. Chief Robert Callahan ran to his office, locking the door behind him, trying to trigger the data wipe protocol. But the screen was already hijacked. One message glowed across the monitor. "Mrs. Martens is no longer in your custody. Now she's ready to teach you a lesson." Callahan collapsed into his chair, hands trembling. He didn't yet realize a storm had officially begun. And at its center was an elderly woman with the memory of a teacher and the will of a warrior. Eleanor Martens. As dawn broke over the crumbling rooftops in the northern quarter of the city, Julian Martens was already present at the temporary command center of the Department of Justice. He wore a white shirt, his suit jacket still unbuttoned, eyes tired but razor-sharp. Before him, a large screen displayed a map of the sealed locations. Precinct 18, the mayor's office, and the private residence of Chief Judge Louis Whitaker. The blinking red markers glowed like wounds bleeding from a system once thought untouchable. "All hardware has been secured," a technician reported. "Internal servers have been transferred to the Federal Data Center. But there's one thing. We discovered an encrypted external hard drive hidden inside the wall of Callahan's office." Julian narrowed his eyes. "Put it on screen." The monitor flickered to footage recovered from the drive. Silent surveillance clips of secret meetings inside the precinct. Callahan accepting envelopes from a businessman. Harris and Meinhardt discussing how to handle a witness. Judge Whitaker signing off on unlawful search warrants after just a few short calls. Julian exhaled. "We don't have a case. We have a legitimized criminal enterprise." In a quiet lounge inside the federal building, Eleanor Martens sat with Lisa Carter, two women who had chosen to confront the system through the strength of their own resolve. "They know it was you who leaked the evidence," Eleanor said, pouring tea. "You can't go back to your old life." Lisa offered a sad smile. "I know. But I also know that if I hadn't, there'd be more people like you, like Jordan, who never got the chance to speak up." Eleanor nodded, her eyes softening. "Then it's time for step 2. Step 2. Change. Exposing the truth isn't enough. We need proposals, new principles, retraining. We have to rebuild trust from the wreckage." Lisa sat silent for a long moment. Then she opened her briefcase and handed Eleanor a file. "I've gathered internal financial records, not just from Precinct 18. Bonus schemes tied to asset forfeiture, response time disparities by neighborhood, and," she slid over a USB drive, "a list of officers who were promoted despite multiple complaints." Eleanor took it wordlessly. She placed it next to her notebook. The pages were no longer filled with mere observations, but now blueprints. Across the city, in a federal safe house, Jordan Carter was focused on writing his testimony for the upcoming hearing. His mother, Annalise Carter, sat beside him, eyes never leaving her son. "Are you sure?" she asked softly. Jordan nodded. "I have to tell it. Not just my story, but everything I saw growing up. The things I thought were normal. Now I know they weren't natural. They were tolerated." He paused, then added a final line to his statement. "Silence is the most fertile soil for injustice to take root." That afternoon, Julian Martens convened the largest press conference since the start of the investigation. Before hundreds of cameras and flashes, he stood beside Eleanor Martens. "We're not just prosecuting individuals," Julian declared. "We are prosecuting a model, the way power mutates when no one is watching. My mother proved that you don't need weapons or authority to expose the truth. Just patience, observation, and courage." Eleanor stepped forward. "No notes. No teleprompter. This is not an ending," she said, her gaze scanning the crowd. "This is a beginning. What I heard and saw in those 24 hours will be recounted, every detail, every name. Not for revenge, but to ensure no one else has to live in fear like I once did." She paused, then smiled. "And if anyone asks whether a 78-year-old woman can shake an entire system, tell them to ask the system itself, whether it's ready to face someone like me." The flashes burst like fireworks. But what ignited wasn't just news. It was truth. And truth, at last, had found a worthy torchbearer. The next morning, at the temporary headquarters of the federal prosecutor's office, Julian Martens carefully flipped through the latest files delivered from neighboring states. The envelope was marked Express. Inside were records of overlooked complaints, quietly closed cases, all showing signs of connection to the same network, a system once centered around Precinct 18. "The storm is spreading," said Sarah Williams, handing Julian a printed report. 3 other precincts in different states are now under review for asset forfeiture abuse and unlawful arrests. Julian nodded, eyes fixed on the data. Ms. Davis didn't just tear down a wall she once faced alone. She's clearing a path for a new generation to understand. Endurance is not the default response. At the newly transformed community center, once the former Precinct 18 headquarters, a landmark event was underway. The launch of the first-ever Community Oversight Committee, composed entirely of locally elected residents, with unrestricted access to the police department's internal records. Eleanor Martens sat in the front row, the familiar string of white pearls around her neck now recognized as a symbol of unyielding dignity. Around her were familiar faces: Jordan Carter, now an intern reporter at the city's newspaper, and Lisa Carter, newly appointed head of Internal Integrity Division. "A year ago, I was arrested without cause. Today, I've been invited to help oversee the very system that once held me," Eleanor said, her voice calm but resolute. "If anyone still doubts whether change is possible, look around." The hall rose to a standing ovation. Meanwhile, at a high-security federal prison, former police chief Bertrand Callahan sat in silence in his cell. He no longer tried to justify himself. Instead, he stared at a bare wall where his once-prized commendations used to hang. Now, those plaques sat in a federal archive, not as trophies, but as evidence of a dismantled legacy. A guard entered with a book in hand. "Someone sent you this," he said, placing it on the table. It was a special edition journal titled, "Lessons from a Silent Protest, Eleanor Martens and the Revival of Justice." Callahan said nothing. He flipped through the pages, then paused at a photo of Eleanor, standing tall in a crowd, holding a sign that read, "Observation is action. Memory is power. Speaking out is change." He closed the book slowly. For the first time in months, he understood. He had been defeated not by force, but by the steadfastness of someone who refused to compromise. That evening, Julian stood by the window of his office looking down at the plaza below where a candlelight vigil was underway, not mourning what had been lost, but honoring those who had been silenced. In the glow of flickering flames, he saw Eleanor standing at the center, her hand gently resting on the shoulder of a young girl, no more than 12, perhaps a former student. He remembered something she once told him. "We don't need a grand revolution. We just need enough people willing to open their eyes, to listen, and to not look away." Julian understood. The greatest battles were never fought in courtrooms or boardrooms. They happened in small decisions, in everyday acts, the way a teacher once led her classroom and now was leading a city. The cleansing of the system had begun. But the rebuilding, the re-education of justice was only just beginning. 6 months after the trials, the city of Arundel was transformed. Walls that once concealed corruption now displayed student artwork about justice and kindness. The former Precinct 18 headquarters, once a symbol of untouchable power, was now a community center named the Eleanor Martens Observatory. Here, a special panel discussion was underway. Eleanor sat beside Jordan Carter, now an independent journalist, and Lisa Carter, leading a new statewide police ethics training program. "The first time I realized true power doesn't lie in the badges we wear, but in what we choose not to do when we see wrong," Lisa said, glancing at Eleanor. "And she reminded me of that." Eleanor only smiled. In another office at federal headquarters, Julian Martens reviewed a new report from other states. For police precincts under reinvestigation for coercive tactics, 2 judges suspended for biased rulings in civilian arrests, and an independent auditing system rolled out in 12 major cities. The storm from Arendelle has reached the East Coast. Sarah Williams, Julian's deputy counsel, remarked. Not a storm, Julian corrected. Eyes on the report. A current. And once it starts, nothing can stop it. In a federal prison on the city's outskirts, Callahan, now an inmate number instead of a chief, sat quietly writing a confession. After months of silence, he began documenting everything. Secret meetings with Whitaker, funds funneled to hidden accounts, names of officers coerced into his system. I should have stopped when I saw fear in a boy's eyes, stopped just for his skin color, he wrote. I didn't. Now I'll tell it all. Not for forgiveness, but to keep the next man from following my path. Meanwhile, Jordan was drafting a new investigative series about communities once oppressed, now rebuilding, not just through policy but through connection. What made people like Callahan think they were untouchable? Jordan asked Eleanor as they strolled through the Central Park, once a heavily patrolled zone, now alive with children playing. Because no one asked them why, Eleanor replied. No one taught them that power without accountability is the most dangerous thing. And now you're asking. Thousands are asking. The cost of silence has been exposed. From here on, every wrong will have a witness. And a memory. In a newly established high school classroom, a young teacher used Eleanor Martens' story to introduce a lesson on civic rights. On the wall hung a photo of Eleanor, standing in a hearing, pointing at a diagram of the corrupt system, her gaze fearless. This isn't just history, the teacher said. It's a lesson in presence. When you see wrong, don't turn away. Eleanor, never seeking legend status, was now a living inspiration for a generation. But she knew there were countless other Eleanors, quietly observing. And when their moment came, they too would speak. Not with shouts, but with clear, timely truth. As she once told Julian, change doesn't start with arguments. It starts with listening and never forgetting. On the first morning of the new academic year at the Arendelle Civic Justice Academy, Eleanor Martens' name graced the honor board in the main hall. In a quiet lecture room, students sat riveted as a video played of Eleanor's arrest at Thompson's Market. Their eyes never left the screen. The instructor, Professor Amelia Grayson, stood aside, letting the silence tell the story. What you just saw wasn't just a civil rights violation, she said finally. It was the spark that brought down a corrupt system over 2 decades old. And it began with a 78-year-old retired teacher who refused to stay silent. In Brussels, Julian Martens was in a virtual meeting with European Union representatives. Nations facing similar issues with police overreach wanted to learn from Arendelle's reform model. Every change needs a moral fulcrum, Julian said firmly. We found ours in my mother. Now our task is to make what she started a scalable system. In a Spartan prison on the capital's outskirts, a silver-haired man wrote letters by hand. William Callahan, former police chief, now inmate, had sent over 30 letters to human rights organizations, confessing, apologizing, warning. In a recent one, he wrote, "If I had one thing to tell anyone wearing a uniform today, it's this: every unethical order leaves a mark. Maybe not immediately, but truth always finds a way out." Jordan Carter's investigative series was nominated for a National Journalism Award. During a televised interview, the host asked, "Do you think you'd be a journalist if not for what happened with Eleanor?" Jordan paused, then said, "No, but I'm also not sure I'd be the person I needed to become if I hadn't seen how she stood her ground. She didn't need to shout to be heard. She just looked straight ahead and never blinked." Eleanor now lived simply in a third-floor apartment in a renovated public housing complex, funded by assets recovered from the case. Daily, she walked to the community center bearing her name, not to manage but to talk, listen, encourage. High school students often sought her out for help with speeches, social campaigns, or tough questions about ethics and justice. One afternoon, as golden sunlight poured through the window, a student asked, "How weren't you scared? Locked up? Watched? With the whole system against you?" Eleanor smiled, her gaze distant. "You know, sometimes silence is scarier. It's complicity. If you don't stand up, who will stand for you? Who'll protect the next child?" At the end of the Open Justice Center's hallway, once the old holding area, a painting hung. Eleanor among students, her hand on Jordan's shoulder, Lisa Carter handing over a thick file in the background. Below it, Eleanor's own words. I was just a teacher. I had no power, only memory, patience, and time. And so, the ending of the Precinct 18 case wasn't truly an end. It was the start of a new generation, one that no longer believed power meant untouchable. A generation that understood justice isn't just a legal principle. It's a personal choice, repeated, daily, in every action. 6 months after the verdicts, a special ceremony took place at Arundel's City Hall, once a symbol of political power, now a space for transparency and accountability. On a stage adorned simply in white and blue, the figures at the heart of the political storm, now icons of change, stepped forward, not for glory, but to share the journey behind their victory. Eleanor Martens, in a refined gray coat, approached the podium slowly. Under the lights, her familiar pearl necklace gleamed as a reminder of history. The crowd fell silent. She began, "This is not a closing ceremony. This is an invitation to begin." The audience leaned in. She continued, "We've broken a structure of power. But remember, power doesn't create itself. It's fed by indifference, by fear, by good people choosing silence." She looked out at Jordan Carter, Lisa Carter, Julian Martens, and hundreds of citizens. Her voice was slow, deliberate. We cannot return to old habits. Justice isn't sustained by grand victories. It lives through small choices, choosing to stand when others are pushed down, choosing to listen instead of judge, choosing to act when it's easier to turn away. The applause rose, not rushed, but steady, like the pulse of a community coming back to life. A week later, at a law classroom in Leiden University, Netherlands, Eleanor Martens' name appeared on the first slide of a lecture. Living proof of civic action leading to political reform. Students from across Europe debated the legality of the case's decisions, the role of individual witnesses in shifting power structures. In a small room behind the library, an Irish student whispered to a peer, "If it were me, arrested like her, would I dare stay silent and observe?" Her friend replied, "I don't know, but I know I wouldn't dare pretend not to see after reading about her." In Arundel, the Eleanor Martens Community Center hosted its first course on power analysis and civic resistance. Lisa Carter led it. No longer in a police uniform, her voice remained firm. Systems always protect themselves. Don't wait for permission to speak up. Practice it every day. In the community library, a young black girl read a book with Eleanor's face on the cover. Her mother, a working-class woman, whispered, "She's real, not a movie hero. That's why she matters more." That evening, Eleanor sat on her apartment balcony. On the table was a letter from a law student, thanking her for inspiring a career defending the vulnerable. She read it slowly, then folded it, gazing out at the city. Under the streetlights, she saw a group of teens handing out flyers advocating for an independent oversight committee. One, in a leather jacket, looked up, caught her eye and waved. Eleanor smiled, nodding slightly. A breeze brushed her pearl necklace. Night fell over Arundel, a city with much still to do, but no longer afraid of the truth. Because the truth had been spoken and heard. Autumn arrived gently in Arundel. Leaves turned golden along the ancient trees lining Steinberg Avenue. The air wasn't quite peaceful, but it carried the calm of knowing justice, however slow, could arrive. At the Eleanor Martens Judicial Reform Center, a special conference gathered lawmakers, activists, officers, and community leaders from across Europe. The theme, from silence to action, rebuilding trust between people and the law. Lisa Carter stood at the podium beside a banner of Eleanor. Sharp features, unflinching gaze, and the caption, "No change begins in silence." Lisa began, "We're not here to share a victory. We're here to share a roadmap, full of stumbles, losses, and hope." She recounted the journey. Shredded reports, late nights backing up data in a darkened apartment. She spoke of Jordan Carter, now a journalist with a major outlet, investigating human rights abuses. And of Eleanor, the woman who first dared to stare down a system others had quietly bowed to. A delegate from Prague stood. "Do you think this model can work in countries where power is still tied to force and silence?" Lisa didn't hesitate. "Eleanor told me, truth doesn't depend on where you stand. It depends on whether you dare to speak. And I believe that's universal." Meanwhile, in a courtroom in southern Arundel, the final trial of the sprawling case unfolded. The defendant, a former financial advisor to Mayor Kensington. No cameras, no media frenzy. But Eleanor was there, in the public gallery, taking notes with her old fountain pen. The new judge, fair and composed, declared, "Based on evidence from independent investigations and verified witness testimony, this court finds the defendant guilty." No applause, just the sound of Eleanor's pen gliding across paper. A steady, deliberate stroke, like the way she taught civic ethics to students for 40 years. That evening, she sat with Jordan Carter in a small cafe near the main square. He showed her the first draft of his book, Lessons from a Cell. Eleanor read the opening pages. Jordan asked, "Do you think people will really change after all this?" She looked up, her gaze gentle but firm. "Change isn't a destination, it's a process. But if we plant enough seeds, one day a forest will grow." Jordan nodded. He understood now more than ever. On the table between them sat Eleanor's black tea and the draft of a new chapter. Not just for the city, but for a generation learning that justice isn't a concept. It's an action, repeated, tirelessly, and sometimes it begins with an elderly woman, her memory sharp as a blade, her heart never bowed.